Chapter 4. The Three Women in Mazoc. The heroines of Mazoc have in common a well-developed and muscular figure, a proud nature, an imperious will and a cruel disposition even in their moments of tenderness and naivete. The Oriental courtesan, the awe-inspiring Tsarina, the Hungarian or the Polish revolutionary, the servant mistress, the Sarmatian peasant girl, the cold mystic, the genteel girl, all share these basic traits. Whether she is a princess or a peasant girl, whether she is clad in ermine or sheepskin, she is always the same woman. She wears furs, she wields a whip, she treats men as slaves, and she is both by creation and the true Sarmatian woman. But beneath this apparent uniformity we may distinguish three very different types of women. The first type is that of the Grecian woman, the pagan, Hetera or Aphrodite, the generator of disorder. Her life, in her own words, is dedicated to love and beauty. She lives for the moment. She is sensual, she loves whoever attracts her and gives herself accordingly. She believes in the independence of woman and in the fleeting nature of love. For her the sexes are equal, she is hermaphrodite. But it is Aphrodite, the female principle, that triumphs, as awful on man's Hercules with woman's attire. She conceives equality merely as the critical moment at which she gains dominance over man, for man trembles as soon as woman becomes his equal. She is modern, and denounces marriage, morality, the church, and the state as the inventions of man, which must be destroyed. She is the dream character who appears in the opening chapter of Venus. We meet her again at the beginning of The Divorced Woman, where she makes a lengthy profession of faith. In the Siren she is the imperious and coquettish Zenobia who creates havoc in the patriarchal family, inspires the women of the household with the desire to dominate, subjugates the father, cuts the hair of the son in a curious ritual of baptism, and causes everyone to dress in clothes of the opposite sex. At the other extreme we find the sadistic woman. She enjoys hurting and torturing others, but it is significant that her actions are prompted by a man or otherwise performed in concert with a man, whose victim she is always liable to become. It is as though the primitive Grecian woman had found her Grecian man or Apollonian element, her virile sadistic impulse. Mazoc often introduces a character which he calls the Greek, or indeed Apollo, who intervenes as a third party to incite the woman to sadistic behavior. In The Fountain of Youth, Countess Elizabeth Nadesty tortures young men in collaboration with her lover, the fearful-eyed Volker. To this end they invent one of the rare machines to be found in Mazoc's writing, a steel woman in whose arms the victim is held fast. The lovely inanimate creature began her work, thousands of blades shot out of her chest, her arms, her legs and her feet. In The Hyena of the Pausta, Anna Clara performs her sadistic acts in league with the brigand chief. Even the heroine of The Fisher of Souls, Dragomira, in charge of the chastisement of the sadistic Boguslav Soltag, is swayed by his argument that they are both of the same race and concludes an alliance with him. In Venus the heroine, Wanda, sees herself at first as a Grecian woman and ends up believing she is a sadist. At the beginning she identifies with the woman in the dream, the hermaphrodite. In a fine speech, she declares, "I admire the serene sensuality of the Greeks, pleasure without pain, it is the ideal I strive to realize. I do not believe in the love preached by Christianity and our modern knights of the spirit. Take a look at me, I am worse than a heretic, I am a pagan." Despite holy ceremonies, oaths, and contracts, no permanence can ever be imposed on love. It is the most changeable element in our transient lives. Can you deny that our Christian world is falling into decay? But at the end of the novel she behaves like a sadist. Under the influence of the Greek she has Severin whipped by him. I was dying of shame and despair. What was most humiliating was that I felt a wild and supersensual pleasure in my pitiful situation, lashed by Apollo's whip and mocked by the cruel laughter of my Venus. But Apollo whipped all poetry from me as one blow followed the next, until finally, clenching my teeth in impotent rage, I cursed myself and my voluptuous imagination, and above all woman and love. Thus the novel culminates in sadism. Wanda goes off with the cruel Greek toward new cruelties, while Severin himself turns sadist or, as he puts it, becomes the hammer. It is clear, however, that neither the hermaphroditic nor the sadistic type represents Mazoc's ideal. In The Divorced Woman the egalitarian pagan woman is not the heroine but the friend of the heroine, the two friends being like two extremes. In The Siren the imperious Zenobia, the Hetera who spreads havoc everywhere, is finally defeated by the young Natalie who is just as domineering but in an altogether different way. The opposite pole, the sadistic woman, is equally unsatisfactory. Dragomira, in The Fisher of Souls, is not truly sadistic in the first place. Moreover, in forming an alliance with Soltag, she degrades herself and loses all significance. She is finally defeated and killed by the young Anita, whose type is more truly in keeping with Mazoc's idea. In Venus the adventure begins with the theme of the Hetera and ends with the sadistic theme, yet the essential part of the story is enacted in between these two extremes, in another element. The two themes do not represent the masochistic ideal but rather the endpoints between which this ideal swings, like the span of the pendulum. At one extreme masochism has yet to come into operation, and at the other it has already lost its raison d'etre. The character of the woman torturer regards these outer limits with a mixture of fear, revulsion, and attraction, since she never quite knows whether she will be able to maintain her prescribed role, and fears that she might at any moment fall back into primitive heterism or forward into the other extreme of sadism. Anna, in The Divorced Woman, declares that she is too weak, too capricious, the capriciousness of the hetera, to incarnate Julian's ideal. In Venus, Wanda only becomes sadistic because she can no longer maintain the role that Severin has imposed on her. It was you who stifled my feelings with your romantic devotion and insane passion. What is the essential masochistic element, the scene between the two boundaries where the crucial action takes place? What is the intermediate feminine type between the hetera and the sadist? Only by piecing together the various descriptions of her in Mazoc's writings can we hope to arrive at this fantastic character, this fantasy. In A Conti Rose, The Aesthetics of Ugliness, he describes the mother of the family, an imposing woman, with an air of severity, pronounced features, and cold eyes, who nevertheless cherishes her little brood. Marzia is described as being like an Indian woman or a Tartar from the Mongolian desert. She has the tender heart of a dove together with the cruel instincts of the feline race. Lola likes to torture animals and dreams of witnessing or even taking part in executions, but in spite of her peculiar tastes, the girl was neither brutal nor eccentric. On the contrary, she was reasonable and kind, and showed all the tenderness and delicacy of a sentimental nature. In The Mother of God, Martina is gentle and gay, and yet she is stern, cold and a master torturer. Her lovely face was flushed with anger, but her large blue eyes shone with a gentle light. Naira Baranov is a haughty nurse with a heart of stone, but she becomes the tender fiancée of a dying man, and eventually meets her own death in the snow. In Moonlight we finally come upon the secret of nature. Nature herself is cold, maternal, and severe. The trinity of the masochistic dream is summed up in the words, cold, maternal, severe, icy, sentimental, cruel. These qualities point to the difference between the woman torturer and her counterparts, the hetera and the sadist. Their sensuality is replaced by her supersensuous sentimentality, their warmth, and their fire by her icy coldness, their confusion by her rigorous order. The sadistic hero, just as much as the feminine ideal of Mazoch, professes an essential coldness which Sada calls apathy. But one of our main problems is precisely to ascertain whether, with respect to cruelty, the apathy of the sadist is not completely different from the coldness of the ideal masochistic type. There is once more a danger of merely reinforcing the sadomasochistic abstraction by equating what are in fact two very different kinds of coldness. The apathy of the sadist is essentially directed against feeling. All feelings, even and especially that of doing evil, are condemned on the grounds that they bring about a dangerous dissipation which prevents the condensation of energy and its precipitation into the pure element of impersonal and demonstrative sensuality. Try to turn into pleasure all things that alarm your heart. All enthusiasm, even and especially the enthusiasm for evil, is condemned because it enchains us to secondary nature and is still a residue of goodness within us. In the novels of Sada, the true libertines mistrust those characters who are still subject to emotional outbursts, and who show that, even in the midst of evil and for evil's sake, they are liable to be converted to the first misfortune. The coldness of the masochistic ideal has a quite different meaning. It is not the negation of feeling but rather the disavowal of sensuality. It is as if sentimentality assumed in this instance the superior role of the impersonal element, while sensuality held us prisoner of the particularities and imperfections of secondary nature. The function of the masochistic ideal is to ensure the triumph of ice-cold sentimentality by dint of coldness. The coldness is used here, as it were, to suppress pagan sensuality and keep sadistic sensuality at bay. Sensuality is disavowed, and no longer exists in its own right, thus Mazoch can announce the birth of the new man devoid of sexual love. Masochistic coldness represents the freezing point, the point of dialectical transmutation, a divine latency corresponding to the catastrophe of the Ice Age. But under the cold remains a supersensual sentimentality buried under the ice and protected by fur. This sentimentality radiates in turn through the ice as the generative principle of new order, a specific wrath and a specific cruelty. The coldness is both protective milieu and medium, cocoon, and vehicle. It protects supersensual sentimentality as inner life, and expresses it as external order, as wrath, and severity. Mazoch was acquainted with the work of his contemporary Bachofen, an eminent ethnologist and Hegelian jurist. Is not Bachofen, as much as Hegel, the inspiration behind the dream at the beginning of Venus? Bachofen distinguished 3 eras in the evolution of humanity. The first is the heteric or Aphroditic era, born in the lustful chaos of primeval swamps. Woman's relations with men were many and fickle. The feminine principle was dominant and the father was nobody. This phase, typified by the ruling courtesans of Asia, has survived in such institutions as temple prostitution. The second, or Demetrian era, dawned among the Amazons and established a strict gynocratic and agricultural order. The swamps were drained. The father or husband now acquired a certain status, but he still remained under the domination of the woman. Finally, the patriarchal or Apollonian system established itself. Matriarchy surviving in degenerate Amazonian or even Dionysian forms. Point 11. Mazoch's 3 feminine types can easily be recognized in these 3 stages, the first and third eras being the limits between which the second oscillates in its precarious splendor and perfection. Here the fantasy finds what it needs, namely a theoretical and ideological structure which transforms it into a general conception of human nature and of the world. Talking about the art of the novel, Mazoch remarked that we must proceed from the schema to the problem. From our starting point in the obsessive fantasy we must progress to the theoretical framework where the problem arises. Point 12. How does the Greek ideal become transformed into the masochistic ideal, the chaotic sensuality of the heteric era into the new order of gynocratic sentimentality? Obviously through the catastrophe of the glacial epoch, which accounts for both the repression of sensuality and the triumphant rise of severity. In the masochistic fantasy, fur retains its utilitarian function. It is worn less for the sake of modesty than from fear of catching cold. Venus must hide herself in a vast fur lest she catch cold in our abstract northern clime, in the icy realm of Christianity. Mazoch's heroines frequently sneeze. Everything is suggestive of coldness: marble body, women of stone, Venus of ice, are favorite expressions of Mazoch. His characters often serve their amorous apprenticeship with a cold statue, by the light of the moon. The woman in the dream, at the beginning of Venus, expresses in her speech a romantic nostalgia for the lost world of the Greeks. You cannot begin to appreciate love as pure bliss and divine serenity, you modern men, you children of reason. As soon as you try to be natural you become vulgar. Stay in your northern mists and Christian incense. You do not need the gods, they would freeze to death in your climate. That is indeed the essence of the matter, the catastrophe of the Ice Age having engulfed the world of the Greeks and with it the type of the Grecian woman. Both sexes found themselves impoverished. Men became coarse and sought a new dignity in the development of consciousness and thought, as a reaction to man's heightened consciousness. Woman developed sentimentality, and toward its coarseness, severity. The glacial cold was wholly responsible for the transformation. Sentimentality became the object of man's thought, and cruelty the punishment for his coarseness. In the cold-hearted alliance between man and woman, it is this cruelty and sentimentality in woman that compel man to thought and properly constitute the masochistic ideal. Like Sada, Mazoch distinguishes 2 natures, but he characterizes them differently. Coarse nature is ruled by individual arbitrariness, cunning and violence, hatred and destruction, disorder and sensuality are everywhere at work. Beyond this lies the great primary nature, which is impersonal and self-conscious, sentimental and supersensual. In the prologue to Mazoch's Galician Tales, a character known as the Wanderer indicts nature for being evil. Nature replies in her own defense that she is not hostile and does not hate us, even when she deals death, but always turns to us a threefold face: cold, maternal, severe. Nature is the steppe. Mazoch's descriptions of the steppe are of great beauty, especially the one that appears at the beginning of Frinko Balaban. The representation of nature by the identical images of the steppe, the sea, and the mother aims to convey the idea that the steppe buries the Greek world of sensuality and rejects at the same time the modern world of sadism. It is like a cooling force which transforms desire and transmutes cruelty. This is the messianic idealism of the steppe. It does not follow that the cruelty of the masochistic ideal is any the lesser than primitive or sadistic cruelty, than the cruelty of whims or that of wickedness. Although masochism always has a theatrical quality that is not to be found in sadism, the sufferings it depicts are not, for all that, simulated or slight, neither is the ambient cruelty less great. The stories of Mazoch record excruciating tortures. What characterizes masochism and its theatricality is a peculiar form of cruelty in the woman torturer, the cruelty of the ideal, the specific freezing point, the point at which idealism is realized. Masochist three women correspond to three fundamental mother images. The first is the primitive, uterine, enteric mother, mother of the cloaca and the swamps. The second is the edible mother, the image of the beloved, who becomes linked with the sadistic father as victim or as accomplice, and in between these two, the oral mother, mother of the steppe, who nurtures and brings death. We call her intermediate, but she may also come last of all, for she is both oral and silent and therefore has the last word. Freud saw her thus in the theme of the three caskets, in agreement with many themes from mythology and folklore. The mother herself, the beloved who is chosen after her pattern, and finally the mother earth who receives him again a third of the fates alone, the silent goddess of death, will take him into her arms. Her true place, however, is between the two others, although she is displaced by an inevitable illusion of perspective. In this connection we feel that Bergler's general thesis is entirely sound. The specific element of masochism is the oral mother. 13 The ideal of coldness, solicitude, and death, between the uterine mother and the edible mother. We must wonder all the more why so many psychoanalysts insist on discovering a disguised father image in the masochistic ideal, and on detecting the presence of the father behind a woman torturer.